It's interesting that this particular film comes out now, and we're handling this in such a way as to we talk about was this the proper decision. The National World War II Museum just opened its United States Freedom Pavilion, Boeing Center, and one of the exhibits in that new building is a series of 5 questions. And the 5 questions are problems. How would you have handled such problems? One deals with the question of the Japanese Americans fighting, leaving their families being interred, and was it the proper thing for them to fight, or would they fight? Same thing dealt with African Americans and segregation. So, without further ado, Professor, was MacArthur's decision the right decision?
I think it was. You heard in the movie, which, by the way, congratulations, Gary. I've been working in U.S.-Japan relations and teaching this and writing on it for a long time, and it was a wonderful movie. The movie captures the reasons why, because without the emperor, Japan would have entered into chaos. There were Gallup polls in 1945 that showed a majority of Americans wanted the emperor to hang. And a lot of Truman's key advisors agreed. There were some, Secretary of War Stimson, Secretary of the Navy Forrestal, who said, we're going to need Japan after the war. We can't have a huge vacuum in the Pacific. And I think that was the strategic context, and then General Fillers filled in the details on the ground, and it was the right decision. Without Japan beginning to rebuild, we would have had a heck of a time responding to Korea. Without the US-Japan alliance, which we formed, we would not have been able to contain the Soviets in the Pacific. And today, it's the US-Japan alliance that gives us the best chance we have to help ensure that China's rise is peaceful and good for all of us. I worked for President George W. Bush, as you mentioned, and he used to marvel and sometimes speak publicly about the fact that his dad fought the Japanese in the Pacific, but that he considered one of his best friends of all the world's leaders, Junichiro Koizumi, the Prime Minister of Japan. And to me, that, more than anything, the fact that in polls, Americans and Japanese say they trust each other more than just about anybody shows this set us on the right path. It wasn't the only thing that did it, but had MacArthur not made that decision, things may have gone in a very different direction.
Gary, what caused you to become interested in this question? And a little bit really unknown issue.
Yeah. Yoko Narahashi started this project a number of years ago. In fact, her grandfather is the character Sekia. And she had heard stories and found some personal papers of his, contacted a very good friend of ours who was one of the writers of the film, David Klass, and wanted to tell a story about 60, 70 years later, how these two countries had somehow, after a brutal battle, had found a way to make peace and to have a lasting peace. And so she and David worked on a script. Eugene and I were approached shortly thereafter. And as an American, first of all, it was a story that I didn't know a lot about. I do read, I did study history. I certainly knew the grand scheme of what happened in Japan after the war. But this specific story was new to me. And I marveled at the fact that two countries who had just battled brutally found a way, and people found a way to take a look at the bigger picture and to try to figure out it's not about revenge, it's about long-term peace and how do we move forward. And I think relating it to the issues of today, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, wherever we are in the world, wherever the conflicts are, I found a bridge. And I felt that if we could find a way to tell a story in an entertaining and dramatic way, that it sheds light on a period of time, which I think is very important for us to remember, and find a connection to what we're doing today, and allow us to kind of think again about some of the decisions that we're making as we move forward in 2013.
Gene?
This story I'm Japanese, raised in Tokyo with a very clear American accent.
Went to the American school,
Yes, I was in the American school in
educated in the
Japan.
American school at Tokyo.
And this story, like, I went through a bunch of Japanese school books. There's none of this information in school books in Japan. So a lot of the kids my age, younger, they have no information. They know of MacArthur, but none of the stuff that actually happened during the war, and even this story, not many people know about. And in a way, it's still a controversial subject, dealing with the emperor. But I think it's about time that a story like this has to come out. And it has to come out because, for me personally, is because of what's recently happened with Japan, with the tsunami and everything. It's a time to rebuild. And that's pretty much my message with this film, is we did it back then, we can do it again now. And it's, for me, that's kind of my motivation for this film. But it'll open up a lot of doors and windows and everything for Japan. And I hope it does the same here.
Bill, you have any care to comment? You were there.
I'll tell you, I was a little bit, I don't know what word to use, but disappointed it didn't show what brought us to dropping that bomb in that movie. I was 18 years old in the infantry. Spent all my time in the Pacific, seeing kamikaze attacks and other things. And some of the inhuman things that went on by the enemy to our soldiers, I can't even describe, and I won't. And the thing that I was a little disappointed in the movie is all it does is show the destruction of the atomic bomb. Well, I'll tell you what, gentlemen, if it hadn't been for that atomic bomb, I wouldn't be sitting here. We were just over the horizon waiting to make sure that treaty was signed. And had it not been signed, we would have invaded Japan, and a lot of us, and I'd say multitudes of us, would have not come home. And as far as I'm concerned, on the movie, it needs to show a little bit more of why and how we got to what you're talking about in the end of the thing.
Well, what I'll say is that we don't take a position. Clearly, the bomb was necessary to create peace and to create an end to the conflict. And what we tried to focus on in the story is this period of time after, and Fellers and MacArthur and the team's decision on what to do with the emperor, clearly. And we don't take any emphasis away, personally, from all that was done. We look, Eugene and I have had some very interesting moments while we were making this movie. There were scenes that we shot where I had a certain emotional point of view, and he had a completely different one, just because of where we're from. And I think what's part of what we tried to do with the film is try to create a balanced perspective so that we understand the feelings on both sides, not taking away from the horrible things that were done, no doubt. So
Well,
hopefully you understand. We're not trying to de-emphasize that.
My problem of it is, with our young people and the people coming up in the United States today, seeing this movie, it don't show any of the things that brought us to dropping that bomb. And I think it should have had maybe 5 or 10 minutes of that, so that the general public who are not educated on that thing might get a little bit of idea of why we dropped that bomb.
Understood.
Well, it's a point well taken, and I'll tell you that when we were debating the issue of the display of the Enola Gay in the Smithsonian's exhibit, during that year I had a crew, an American and a Japanese girl that followed me around. They were from NHK. PBS network in Japan. We went to Washington in the commander's office preparing for a backgrounder, which is a lot of questions, and then you go up and sit down and go through an interview. And I really got aggravated after an hour or so of this, going through the same stuff, and we'd been going through it all year. And finally, the young man said, Commander, you know who I am? I said, yeah. Well, you said you were a full-blooded American. He said, yeah, and I'm married to a Japanese girl. He said, but her father thinks that Harry Truman's the greatest man that ever walked the earth. I said, what are you talking about? He said, he was a kamikaze pilot. Had Truman not dropped the bomb, he wouldn't be here. So, this raises a lot of issues. And I want to ask one thing before we try to maybe get to the audience a little bit. Factually, Professor, how close is the story?
Well,
I'm not talking about boy meets girl and
Right,
that
okay.
sort of thing, And I was disappointed. I saw Sleepless in Miami. Sleepless in Seattle. Loved it. My wife loved it more. So tell me, how close?
I think the overall, within GHQ, within MacArthur's headquarters, I thought the film very accurately captured what it was like, the memorandum fellows had to write. You couldn't tell the whole story of what was going on in Washington and what the British were asking us to do and the other allies. History isn't ever as simple as a movie can make it, but I thought it captured in that one place at that time. And the thing that was really fascinating is MacArthur's headquarters, as the film really beautifully shows, if you've been to Tokyo, you can still see it, it's right across the street from the Imperial Palace. So in that small space, one side of which survived the bombing because we chose not to bomb the Imperial Palace, the rest of the city destroyed. In that one place, the movie captured, I thought very accurately, the decision-making and in a way what the entire U.S. government was thinking through on this. I think there were some things that probably were changed. For example, I thought Aya survived the war, for example. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. So there was some artistic license on some of the boy meets girl and some of the personal story, but I thought on the history it captured it well. It would have been good to show some of the what got us into the war. I'm of a different generation. It didn't occur to me until my partner here on stage mentioned it. But in a way, I wonder whether a younger generation will see between the lines that this was what Japan brought on themselves.
Well, there's only a little mention that I recall, and that was dealing with the oil blockade.
Yeah.
And that's that you go back to that, but it's quick, and unless you know the story and you know the history of what was going on at the time, you don't understand that comment about the cutting off the oil to Japan.
We shot some scenes that are not in the film of some of the soldiers in Feller's office looking at pictures of American GIs in prisoner of war camps and horrific images. And we chose not to include it because we felt like it was I don't know, that it would be difficult to tell both stories, to be, it's so hard just to tell a clear version of what this decision was about. Our hope is that people will see this movie and delve further into reading and looking into the history of what happened in World War II in the Pacific.
We had a couple screenings in Japan, and people from the U.S. Embassy. And then we had people from the Japanese, the politicians and stuff, and they both saw it together. And after that, they decided to go out to dinner together, and they had a discussion. I wasn't there. I was unfortunately over here, but they kept talking about it. But there's so much stuff that from the Japan side, which is really still unknown.
Well, we found in the discussions that we had over that year, Japan has never really told its people the whole story.
They have never told, and I don't know if they will, but this is going to definitely open up a lot of doors for discussions.
We had screenings in Japan, and the end of the movie, some of the men who were old enough to have been a part of either the war or conscious enough of what was going on, tears rolling down their faces. You know, Japanese culture, you know, it's very difficult to show emotion publicly. There's issues of shame. And I think, you know, our hope is the older generation, which has held in so much feeling over this period of time, and the younger generation that really doesn't understand because they weren't taught or told or talked to about what happened during World War II, will come together with this film and have a conversation and get past it, because, you know, we think it will be powerful and emotional for that culture to just finally deal with it, because they really haven't.
Well, I know it's tough on our people, those that were there. There's no question
No doubt.
about that. And that's never going to go away. It's never going to go away. It's one thing to you know, Steve Ambrose always talked about the fact that we are not a conquering nation. We will go in and we will do what we have to do, but we will then be giving out candy and chewing gum as we enter.
Yep.
So we're not a conquering nation. But at the same time, it left a lot of scars, and it's clear that Bill is telling us this. And I don't know if you're going to put out a DVD eventually and put some extra stuff on it, but you might want to think about what he's telling you.
No doubt. Look, we have tremendous pride as an American, and all of us who made the film have tremendous pride for the sacrifice that was made by the soldiers of the U.S. during the war. In fact, I think this film honors not only, you know, the overall global war, but what the tough decisions they had to make. The world is a peaceful place. After World War I, as we all know, we made different decisions, and 30 years later, World War II broke out. But very tough decisions, forward-thinking decisions were made by very proud, hardworking Americans at the end of World War II, both in the Pacific and in Europe. And the world's a better place for it. And this, you know, we hope this movie will honor those decisions. That's a big part of why we went into this.
So it's your opinion that MacArthur's decision is even relevant today?
No doubt.
You know, I was living in Japan in 1989 when Emperor Hirohito died. And I was working at the time as the only American in the Japanese Diet, in the Japanese parliament. And it was an amazing time. One of my duties was to tell a group of Japanese veterans who were politicians that the emperor died, because we were in Hawaii when it happened at a US-Japan conference. And several of them passed out. They were so overcome by emotions. Then back in Japan, people my age who had never spoken about the emperor suddenly started speaking. And veterans, you know, parents of my friends, Japanese, started talking about the war. And there was this sort of cathartic moment where everyone would talk about all different generations, all different ideologies, people who had opposed the war, people who had fought in it. I think this movie has some potential to rekindle that. And I think it's a tough call that the directors and producers had on how much to tell the story of the war itself. And I can see how if you had done too much of that, you would have, you know, killed that, you know, second kindling of debate in Japan, in the U.S. and frankly, in a lot of countries were affected by what the Japanese did. The Dutch, the British, the Australians, not to mention Koreans and Chinese. I think it's a tough call for you guys, but I think the way you did it is going to make the most impact in terms of how this is debated, and frankly, how Japanese themselves reflect on what happened, which is important because one of the consequences of the decision, which was a good decision as a matter of U.S. national interests, one of the consequences was these debates were frozen. The emperor was still there. These debates were frozen, and I think this film's going to thaw that situation and open up some more debate, which is a good thing.
Well, it also may cause some problems over here, too,
It may, yeah.
you know, without any question.
Yeah.
Bill?
Well, I guess I'm still prejudiced. I still think it should have shown a little bit of background.
And there's nothing wrong with that. That's why I threw out the comment that they're going to do a DVD, pick up some of that stuff
We're
off
going to do that, and we're going to find you in Salt Lake City, Bill. We're going to get you commentary on that.
One thing I want you all to remember, our freedom is not free.
That's right.
That's right.
You bet.
That's
Understood.
right. That's right. Correct. I know the hour is late, but do we have a question? There's a microphone right there in the middle aisle. Question, comment?
General Carl, go into some detail. What was he doing in Japan before the war?
General Fellers?
General Fellers? What was General Fellers doing in Japan before the war?
General Fellers was given the assignment to write a paper about the psychology of the Japanese soldier before the war, and he did some research and had traveled throughout the country. He had met Aya in college in America and had met, reconnected with her when on his various trips to Japan, but he was there mostly on official business to write this paper, which influenced some of the decisions that MacArthur and his staff made as they were prosecuting the war.
He wasn't a military though at that time?
He was military. He was military. He was probably, I don't know, was he a colonel at that
He
point?
was a major,
Or major?
32,
Major,
yeah.
40?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have a question?
I have a comment and a question. First, the comment for the producer. Towards the very end, when Emperor and MacArthur were together, he put his hands on his hips, which looks like an old McCarthyism or MacArthurism. But in reality, in the Orient, that's a very important gesture to show superiority over the person you're speaking to. So that was a good point. For the professor, I have a question. The scene was fairly short in the Imperial Council when the decision was made the day before they did surrender, but it's pretty close to what I understand happened. Wasn't there a dispute that caused some people, when the emperor asked for unanimity among the people in that Imperial Council, that there was at least one suicide so that they could be unanimous?
There was a suicide. I don't know if it was orchestrated to have unanimity. There's a great book, by the way, called Japan's Longest Day, which describes that one day. You guys probably read it getting ready for this, and how the Japanese radio broadcasters carried the recording and had to sneak and hide and get away from hot-headed nationalists who wanted to kill them. And you captured it in the film quite well, but if you want a real thriller of a novel that's true, this book tells those 24 hours when all this happened.
And on the photograph, we literally tried to copy the original photograph of the two of them, which you see at the end of the movie.
Someone else?
Yeah, Jake Comer, past National Commander of the American Legion. I also have a comment and a question. And the comment is to Bill Gustafsson. I'm so much in favor of what he has tried to say, because in my opinion, as I first look at the film, it starts off with the bombing of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then it goes on to show the reason for surrender. I think if it just briefly opened up the film with Pearl Harbor, which means it would show why we had to drop the bomb. They started the war, not us, but it looked like that we were starting something there at the bombing of two cities. I would like to see the start of the war showing Pearl Harbor and then go into the bombing of the two cities, etc. And then the question, unless I missed something, when it showed the end of all the highlights of who was killed and who died, and MacArthur and this one and that one, The brigadier general that was all through the film that did such an outstanding job of bringing them together, why did Eisenhower reduce him from general to colonel?
Yeah, good question.
You want to answer that? You want me to answer?
You can answer that one. I'll do the Pearl Harbor one.
Okay. Two reasons. One, as you all know, throughout the war, people got promoted fairly quickly, and there were numerous brigadier generals who, when they retired, were reduced to their previous rank. In particular, in this case, there was some history with Fellers and Eisenhower. Early on in the war in North Africa, Fellers was working as an intelligence officer, and there was a transmission that was going to be sent, and Fellers had an issue with the way it was being sent and raised his hand. And it was, he thought it was going to be vulnerable. And he was right. And at the end of the day, Eisenhower blamed him for this code being broken. And Fellers was in a lot of trouble and ended up, political trouble, and ended up reuniting with his friend, Mr. MacArthur, General MacArthur in the Philippines. And Eisenhower and MacArthur certainly had conflict between them. So I think at the end of the day, it was a little bit of payback. As well as something that was done with a number of people as they moved their way quickly through the ranks. Is that fair?
I think it is, and now I'm going to be guilty of Monday morning quarterbacking on the movie, which I really thought was great. But the interesting thing about Pearl Harbor, it would have also shown how angry the American people were and how extraordinary some of these decisions were. And when you talk about, as Bill said, how we got here and the hard, ugly fighting, I thought when the two of them are in college, and it was Grinnell College, I think. In reality, you had to probably protect that. Wonderful liberal arts college in Iowa that has a long history of exchange with Asia. But in 1932, when they're college kids, that's the year Japan finished its conquest of Manchuria, and Japan was expanding. And I was thinking, from 1932 until 1937, as the Japanese were expanding, we didn't build a single battleship. We were so certain that war was obsolete. And that's, there's a lot of lessons in here. And that's another one. You don't want to be playing catch up in 1940, 1941, which is a lesson I think that's a little bit relevant today.
Yeah.
When we look at what's happening, I'd say with the defense budget and with our readiness.
It gives us an opportunity to make a prequel.
There you go.
Yes?
Well, what I'd like to say is that I go along with Jake to a certain extent about showing the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Just looking at this, it's looked like we started the war. If you show this to some kids, they're thinking that we're the aggressors in here by showing that the Enola Gay. What you should do is show, hey, this is how the war started. And then you should show Mr. Truman in that White House trying to make a decision on what to do with this bomb. And let him tell the people that we're going to save so many Americans if we use this bomb.
So many Japanese as well, believe it or not.
Believe it or not? Yeah, you're right. But, I don't want to look like the aggressor on it. I thought that was a pretty good flick, but, let's tell the whole story. And I thank Harry Truman, because if it wasn't for Harry, I wouldn't be here today.
Yes.
Douglas Williams, I'm from Michigan, the Legislative Affairs Chairman. I have a question for the entire group here tonight. I know there's a lot of grandfathers and grandmothers in this audience. I'd like to ask you, how many of you know if your children in high school are actually reaching the point of study in their books about World War II and about the bombing of Hiroshima? I think you'll find that a lot of times the curriculum doesn't even get there.
True.
I had a question for the panel. The portrayal of General Douglas MacArthur, we know he was somewhat of an egomaniac. put it mildly, if you served under him in the Army.
Well, Bill served under him.
I think Bill might
Crawling
agree with-
around, yeah.
I think Bill might agree with me on that. Do you think that his portrayal of the general is right on?
It's for you, Bill.
Well,
He told me earlier that if he tells the truth, they're going to tell you.
you asked me a question. If I answered it, you'd probably throw me out.
No, not at all.
Nevertheless, the Battle of Lady, for instance, I have returned. Yeah, after everything was settled down.
True, true.
And prior to that, he had a mansion on that island.
Yeah.
Yep.
The Japanese probably used it for headquarters when they were there. But lo and behold, after we took over, that mansion, and I went by it a few times, I never even seen a bullet hole in the thing.
Right.
And everything around it was mowed down.
True.
So I could go on and on, but I won't.
Okay. I had one other question. Academia in our colleges, every time we reach the anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, the newspapers in this country always used to try to cover it in another way, almost like it was a negative thing for us to do. And I don't know how you feel about that, but as a veteran, I object to the fact that they do that. It's not correct. Tell the truth and tell this whole story. And as these gentlemen said, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, we didn't start the war. They did. And like they said, putting that bomb where they did on 2 occasions, Nagasaki as well as Hiroshima, saved a lot of lives.
And let me tell you a little bit about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The Smithsonian was going to use the bombing of Pearl Harbor as the beginning of its exhibit, but in such a way that we're going to twist it in such a way that we were still going to come out as the bad guys.
Right.
All we ask is tell the story from the beginning. We have about a 40-minute, 45-minute film at the World War II Museum. It's a 4D situation. And in the first 8 minutes when you're sitting in there, Tom Hanks narrates the introduction to the film. And it goes through the 30s and what was going on worldwide and so forth. And in 8 minutes, so if you're going to just talk about Japan, we could probably just do 4 minutes as an add-on of some sort, because all it takes is about 4 minutes to go through that lead-up, and then what you see then is the bomb is dropped, and then you go into and see the rest of the war. But it doesn't take much. It really doesn't take much to take that edge off of leaving the impression that we're the aggressors. Somebody else.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Tim Smith from Okie from Muskogee here. For me, I enjoyed the film, very much so. And it brought a tear to my eye with the young lady, which maybe that's an improv y'all did. But my father served in Japan. He got there a little late. He turned 17 en route to Japan in 1946. And he came home with a plate in his head from, he was chasing a young lady around, had him a girlfriend, and local police didn't care for it, so he got a whooping. So now for every time he goes to the airport, that's his souvenir for Japan. That's just a side note I wanted to share with you. I never thought about this lesson we didn't learn, I guess. In past wars, I've served in Iraq and Afghanistan and Desert Storm, and when you dismantle the entire government and have to rebuild it, that was very difficult. So maybe we chose the best of the two evils by at least saving the emperor, so it was easier to recreate the government. So that was the perspective I took to it. I enjoyed it. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, that was our intention in telling this story, to talk about really smart, forward-thinking decisions that were made, politically difficult. Difficult to actually, as Bill talks about, MacArthur had a plan that if they didn't surrender, there were going to be 1 million U.S. troops occupying Japan, trying to keep the peace, trying to stop other, parts of the Japanese public from rebelling. And who knows how many lives would have been lost. And there's no doubt, again, I want to be, I really appreciate all the comments we're getting today. We saw this from the beginning, never, and it's interesting. The beginning of the movie for us is a horrible thing, but it is the result of what America had to do to bring the war to an end. We never saw it as an as America as the villain. I mean, I'm moved and it's, that people feel differently. That was never our intention. But our intention solely was to show that, and again, we did this in Europe with Germany and other countries, was to show that America had learned from an experience in World War I, had figured out that the way to create a sustained, peaceful existence for all of us was to not squash, not get revenge, not eviscerate, but was to use the cultures, be smart, find a way to put in place constitutions and get rid of aggressive military so that, yes, the Russians or the Chinese couldn't come into Japan and really be a threat to America, issues in other areas, but that it was about creating a sustained peace. That we thought that was an extremely heroic moment in history that took a lot of guts, and so I just want to say that because we never intended it to feel any differently.
You mentioned to get revenge. What would we have done had Japanese come in and invaded our west coast? Would we still be getting revenge?
It would have been very, very
they had
brutal
plans.
indeed, as
they had plans
people
for
in the
that.
Philippines and Malaysia and a lot of people
Well,
could tell
I guess I'm in the wrong field, but
it's an excellent point though, because had the Japanese, they would not have probably gotten to California, but they might have taken
somewhere.
They did take the Philippines. They might have taken Northern Australia, and it was very, very brutal. And one of the remarkable things about the American way of war, way of peace, is appomattox. MacArthur in Japan, when the United States wins a war, people want revenge. Yeah. But, in one way or another, what makes us, I think, different is that we think about moving on, which is hard if you're a veteran, unbelievably hard. And
we have moved on.
That's right, and the word unconditional surrender that Churchill and FDR demanded in Casablanca, unconditional surrender, that was a word, of course, that came from Ulysses S. Grant, Civil War. But at the end of the war, what Grant did was tell the Confederate officers, you can take your horses, you can take your sidearms. It's a hard thing in the moment, but it's what makes the United States, I think, an exceptional country in the way we've dealt with these things.
Let's take one more question. An hour is late, and I know we've had a long day.
This is sort of a coda back to a question about Bonner Fellers. I'm married to his granddaughter, and so I'm bringing that perspective. And it was an excellent movie. It's a great movie. I think I was very moved by it. And it's emotionally on point, I think, with Bonner Fellers. Some of it is a fictional version, though, of his personal life. I'd say he did meet a Japanese student at college much earlier than the movie says. It was really in 1914 to 1916. And he was a Quaker, a Midwestern Quaker. Quakers are generally on the peace side, trying to maintain peace, and he came from that. He was at a Quaker college, and she was a Christian Japanese due to evangelical movements in Japan, and they had started that in the 1880s, so it was very forward-thinking kind of exchange. he then went to, because the double up of classes in West Point, he went on, he was from the area of Joseph Cannon's area, so he went to West Point, transferred to West Point, and he was in the U.S. military from that time until 1946. So he had tours in the Philippines in early 1920s, and both of them, the Japanese woman he married in the 20s, he was married in 1925 and happily married his whole life. And his wife went with him on his second tour to the Philippines in 1929 to 31, and they went to Japan, and they knew the family of the young woman in Japan. Also, the sort of key family of a writer that he studied, Lafcadio Hearn. And he was also then, as was mentioned, there in the mid-30s, working, he was in charge of the Philippine defense, trying to open their West Point, and then later the sort of between their president and MacArthur. After the war, she did survive the war. She doesn't die in the war. And he found them, and both Lafcadio Hearn's family, and actually she came and had dinner with MacArthur, and she came several times because she was head of a school, and had dinner with MacArthur and conveyed the knowledge of from an educational point of view after the war. So and also about his being retired a colonel. That did occur, but in 1948 he was officially retired as a brigadier general 2 years later. So.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. We thank the panel very much. Bill, thank you very much. Nice to know you, gentlemen, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you. The Legion appreciates the opportunity to screen the film.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for your hospitality.